You know what's worse than being forgotten? Being excluded, quietly, deliberately, by people who pretend to love you. I didn't need a parade for my 30th birthday. I wasn't expecting fireworks or gifts or champagne in crystal flutes. I just wanted to feel like I mattered, like turning 30 meant something to the people who claimed I was family. So I invited them all. 2 weeks in advance. A simple message in the family group chat. Hey everyone, I'm hosting a birthday dinner at my place next Saturday. Just lasagna, wine, and some homemade cake. Would love to have you here. I even followed up. Once. Then again a few days later, with a little smiling emoji at the end. No one responded, but I still cleaned the apartment, scrubbed the kitchen floor until my knees hurt. I borrowed an extra table from Mrs. Edna next door and set it up in the living room, covered it with a plastic lace cloth and 8 place settings. I cooked my mom's lasagna recipe from scratch, layered noodles, ground beef, the whole thing. Even made garlic bread with real butter, not margarine. I lit candles. I put on a sundress. And then I waited. 6 p.m. Nothing. 6:15. I checked my phone. Nothing. 6:30. I rechecked the group chat. Still nothing. Not even a thumbs up emoji. I sat at the corner of the couch and stared at the lasagna, still steaming under foil, while the birthday banner I taped to the wall slowly began to sag on one side. At 6:45, the doorbell rang. I jumped up so fast I almost knocked over a chair. But when I opened the door, it wasn't my mom or my sister or any of my 3 brothers. It was Mrs. Edna, standing there with her signature pink lipstick smudged at the corners and a lemon meringue pie in her trembling hands. Mrs. Edna said, "I saw your kitchen light on." Figured it was a good night for pie. I stepped aside and forced a smile. I said, "You're always welcome, Edna." She walked in, saw the table, and her expression softened. Mrs. Edna said gently, "Did I interrupt a party?" I shook my head. I said, "You're the first guest." She didn't ask questions, just patted my shoulder and walked to the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock. Not the doorbell this time, just a knock. Leo. Leo is the kind of friend you don't make twice in life. He'd known me since we were 7 years old, when we both hid under the jungle gym to avoid gym class. He was out of breath, holding a plastic-wrapped bouquet from the gas station and a ridiculous balloon that said, "You're how old?" Leo said, "Don't hate me, I got off late. Happy birthday, sunshine." I laughed despite myself. I said, "You remembered." Leo replied, "Always." "You made lasagna?" I nodded and waved him in. We sat, just the 3 of us, me, Leo, and Mrs. Edna. 8 places set, 5 untouched. We toasted with grocery store wine. We ate too much bread. Leo told a terrible joke about 2 penguins and a snowblower. And I smiled. I really tried to smile. But around 8:30, while Leo and Edna were debating the merits of boxed pie crust, I picked up my phone again. I hadn't looked at it in hours, and there they were, my entire family, on vacation. My sister wore a floppy hat and sunglasses. My brothers were holding beers on a yacht. My mom and dad smiling for a group photo by the water, holding mojitos. Matching Cabo Crew shirts on all of them. I clicked through the album. There were 15 pictures. Not one caption mentioned my birthday. Not one tag included me. They'd all gone together, coordinated the trip, planned outfits, laughed, toasted. They didn't forget. They chose. They picked the beach over me. I stared at the screen for so long, Leo leaned over and gently took the phone from my hand. Leo said quietly, "I'm sorry, May." I shook my head, suddenly too tired to feel anything. I stood up and walked to the kitchen drawer. Second one from the left. Junk drawer, old batteries, pens that don't work, receipts from 2 apartments ago, and the scratch-off ticket. I bought it on a whim 3 days earlier when I was picking up almond milk. The cashier said, "Feeling lucky today?" And I said, "Sure. Why not?" I almost threw it out yesterday, but something in me held on. I walked back to the table, dropped into my chair, and tossed the ticket down. I said, "Want to see something funny?" Mrs. Edna said, "You won the lottery." I laughed bitterly. I said, "Wouldn't that be something?" I picked up a butter knife, classy, I know, and started scratching. First number, 12, then 43, then 17. I scratched row by row, one match at a time. Leo leaned closer. Leo said, "Wait." I frowned. I said, "What?" Leo looked at the back of the card, then back at the numbers. Leo said again, slower this time, "May, wait." Mrs. Edna leaned in too. She reached for her glasses and slipped them on, squinting. Mrs. Edna said, "You got all 5. I shook my head. I said, "No, that's not right." Leo pulled out his phone. He searched something, scrolled, froze. He looked up, eyes wide. Leo said, "May, this is the $172 million jackpot ticket." Silence. No music, no laughter. Just 3 stunned people and the hum of the old fridge in the corner. I looked at the numbers again, read them out loud. 12th, 43rd, 17th, 29th, 8th, every single one matched. I felt the air get thin, my vision blurred. Leo said softly, "May, say something." I opened my mouth. Then I laughed. Loud, unfiltered, ugly laughed. I said, "They missed one hell of a party." Mrs. Edna reached for my hand across the table and squeezed it. Mrs. Edna said, "You hold on to that ticket, darling, and you don't let anyone take it from you." Leo nodded. Leo said, "You earned this. Not because you're lucky, but because you're good." I held that ticket like it was made of glass. My birthday didn't end with a toast from family or a cake with 30 candles. It ended with 2 people who truly cared, and a miracle tucked between scratched silver and ink. I looked at Leo. I said, "Do you think I should tell them?" Leo raised an eyebrow. Leo said, "Do you want to?" I thought about the lasagna, the empty chairs, the matching Cabo Crew shirts, and I said, "Not yet." For a long time, none of us said a word. We just sat there at my birthday table, me, Leo, and Mrs. Edna, staring down at the little slip of cardboard like it might explode. Leo was the first to break the silence. Leo said, "No way." He blinked, shook his head, then said it again, louder this time. Leo said, "No way. This can't be real." I could barely breathe. I said, "Check it again." He pulled up the lottery site on his phone. The numbers were still there. 12, 43, 17, 29, 8. Then he slowly turned the phone to face me and pointed at each one. Leo said, "That's 5. That's all 5, May. You hit the jackpot." Mrs. Edna clutched her chest like she needed to steady her heartbeat. Mrs. Edna said, "Baby, you better sign that right now." I laughed nervously, my fingers trembling as I flipped the card over. I said, "I don't have a pen." Mrs. Edna immediately dug into her handbag and handed me a blue ballpoint with the words Daisy Hill Pharmacy on the side. She said, "Use this. It's lucky. I won a ham once in a raffle with that pen." My hand shook as I signed the back of the card. Just 3 little letters, M-A-E, but I felt like I was carving them into stone. When the ink dried, I looked up. Leo was crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears sliding down his cheeks, his lips pressed tight together. I whispered, "Why are you crying?" Leo said, "Because I know what this means for you." And that did it. The tears came all at once. Not because of the money, at least, not only because of the money, but because for the first time in years, I felt like something had gone right. Like I was seen. Not by my family, but by the universe itself. It wasn't a scream or a celebration. It was relief. A deep, gut-level exhale. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. Leo wrapped his arm around me. Mrs. Edna reached for a napkin and dabbed at my face like I was a toddler. Mrs. Edna said, "You've been through too much, sweetheart. This is yours. All of it." I whispered, "I don't know what to do." Leo said, "Whatever you want. For the first time, May, you get to choose. Later that night, after the dishes were stacked in the sink and the leftover lasagna wrapped in foil, I slipped on a coat and stepped outside alone. The air was cold for early spring, crisp enough to sting my cheeks, but I didn't mind. I walked around the block with the ticket folded inside my jacket pocket, pressed against my heart. My breath came out in little clouds. My fingers were still trembling. I kept touching my chest like I had to remind myself it was real, that this moment existed. It wasn't until I passed the darkened window of the coffee shop on 3rd and Main that the flashbacks hit. My first rejection email. I had submitted illustrations for a greeting card company. Not commercially viable, they wrote. My second. You might be more suited for a hobby market. I remembered the night I told my mom I was opening an Etsy store. She didn't look up from her crossword puzzle. My mother said, "You'll never be stable unless you marry someone successful." I remembered showing her my first sale, an original print of a watercolor fox, and her smiling like it was cute, not real. My brother once asked me if I still played with paints. My sister told her friends I was freelancing for now until she figures life out. Every holiday, I was the joke, the failure, the one still finding herself at 29. I was never included in career talks. They only asked about my dating life, as if that was all I had to offer. And when I cried, when I asked why it felt like they didn't respect me, my mom would sigh and say, "May, you're being dramatic again." Dramatic, like emotions were some kind of disease, like my hurt wasn't real unless they approved of it. But now, here I was, walking under the streetlights with $172 million in my coat pocket. And not a single one of them knew. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. I stopped by the duck pond in the park and sat on a bench. The sky was clear. I could see Orion's belt over the trees. And for once, I didn't feel small. I felt free. The next morning, I woke up early. My eyes were puffy from crying, but I was alert, sharp, present. I didn't go to work. I didn't text anyone in the family. Instead, I opened my laptop and Googled, what to do when you win the lottery. I read everything. Don't post online. Don't tell extended family. Hire a lawyer. Sign the ticket. Secure it in a safe place. Check, check, check. I sent Leo a text. I wrote, "Still real?" He replied, "More real than ever." Then I searched for lottery attorneys in my area. There were a few. One firm had glowing reviews, specializes in anonymous claims, wealth protection, estate setup. I called. The woman on the phone said, "We can schedule you this afternoon." I said, "Can I come in right now?" Her voice softened. She said, "Yes, come in. We'll take care of you." I arrived at the office in an old hoodie and jeans. The receptionist didn't blink twice. She led me to a private room with warm lighting and offered me tea. When the lawyer came in, Ms. Chow, she didn't waste time. Ms. Chow said, "We've handled over 20 major jackpot cases. You're in the right hands." I slid the signed ticket across the table. She looked at it, then looked at me. Ms. Chow said, "Congratulations, Ms. Ames. Let's begin." And so we did. We set up a trust. We discussed anonymity, tax strategies, long-term asset management. I asked if I could give money to 2 people right away. No strings attached. Ms. Chow said, "You absolutely can." When I got home that afternoon, Leo was already waiting on my doorstep. He said, "I brought coffee and the good croissants." I smiled. I said, "You're getting a new oven." He laughed. Leo said, "Is this your version of a thank you card?" Mrs. Edna joined us later with a tin of cookies and a scarf she knitted for me overnight. We didn't talk about the money much. We just were. 3 people, 1 miracle, and a very quiet, very sacred joy. I didn't scream. I didn't dance. I didn't post a TikTok. Instead, I made a list. Not of what I would buy, but of what I would leave behind. No more begging for their time. No more explaining my choices. No more waiting for a call that wouldn't come. That night, I slept without crying. And in the morning, I woke up not needing permission to exist. I knew the news would get out eventually. My state doesn't allow anonymous lottery claims. It's all public record. The moment I signed that ticket and stepped into that lawyer's office, it was only a matter of time before strangers, and worse, family, would know. Still, I hoped I had a few days of quiet. I got exactly 3. On the morning of day 4, I woke up to 247 unread notifications and a voicemail from a reporter trying to congratulate me and ask for a quote. And sitting at the top of the message stack, a text from my brother Darren. "Wow, heard the news. Congrats, sis. We should catch up soon." Catch up? He hadn't even responded to my birthday invite. The last time I saw Darren, he asked if I was still playing with glitter and glue for a living. I stared at his message for a while. Then my phone buzzed again, Cousin Becca this time. "We were just talking about you in Cabo. You deserve it." I almost choked on my coffee. They were talking about me. They didn't even mention me when they were actually in Cabo on my birthday, celebrating my sister-in-law's spa week. But now that my name was in the news, and next to a number with 8 zeros, they couldn't stop thinking about me. Another buzz. This time, it was from my mother. "May, we're so proud of you. We always knew you were special. This is such a blessing for our family." Our family. Like they were part of the win. Like they'd held my hand through the sleepless nights and the rejections and the lasagna that never got eaten. The messages kept coming all morning. "You're famous now. Let's do lunch soon. So when's the celebration party?" None of them acknowledged what happened just a week earlier. No apologies, no explanations. No. Sorry we left you behind. Just messages as if we'd always been close. By noon, the asks started. Aunt Rena reached out next. "So happy for you, sweetie. My youngest is starting college soon. Maybe you could help out a bit." Then came Uncle Marty. "I've got a business idea I think you'd love. Want to invest together?" And Darren again. "I've been meaning to refinance the house. Maybe we can chat? Family discount?" But the boldest message came from Aunt Linda, who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. "May, you know we all raised you. It takes a village. We all deserve a piece of that blessing. A piece of the blessing." Like I'd baked a cake and forgotten to hand out slices. I didn't respond to any of them right away. I just sat there at my kitchen table, same as always, same chipped mug, same creaky chair, and read their words with a heart that had already learned to stop hoping. They didn't miss me. They missed the money. That evening, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the 4th time, I answered. I said, "Hello." My father said, "May, finally." He sounded annoyed, like I was the one who owed him an explanation. I stayed silent. He said, "I'm sure you're getting a lot of attention right now, but we need to talk." I asked, "About what?" He said, "About how this money affects the family. What's your plan?" I said, "My plan?" He replied, "You can't just hoard that kind of money. You need to think about legacy, about taking care of your own." I laughed quietly. I said, "That's funny. I was thinking about taking care of my own." He didn't catch the tone. He said, "Exactly. Good. Because there's some immediate needs. Your mother and I have been underwater on the mortgage since the pandemic, and Darren's trying to start a business. It's time to step up." Step up. Like I was suddenly responsible for everyone's life just because they saw me in a headline. I said, "Where were you last weekend?" He paused for a beat. Then he said, "We were in Cabo. It was a trip we planned months ago." I said, "You planned it with everyone." "Except me." He replied, "May, don't start. You've always taken things too personally. You weren't excluded. You were just Busy, I thought. I said, "You didn't even ask if I was." He snapped, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're still emotional. You need to be more level-headed now. Think like someone with responsibilities." I said, "I have responsibilities." To myself, to the people who showed up. He said firmly, "Be reasonable. Family comes first." I stared at the wall, at the crooked photo of me and my mom when I was 10, holding a pine cone in the mountains, both of us laughing. Then I said, "Funny? That's what I thought too." And I hung up. That night, Leo came over with takeout and a sly look on his face. Leo said, "I saw Aunt Linda posted something weird on Facebook." I asked, "Yeah?" Leo said, "She called you the spiritual glue of the family." I nearly snorted rice through my nose. I said, "Spiritual glue? That's rich." Leo lifted his drink. Leo said, "To glue." I tapped my glass against his and smiled. Then I turned off my phone. In the days that followed, the requests grew more desperate. "Please just hear me out. We're family, May. I've always believed in you. You wouldn't even be who you are without us." That last one hit hardest, because it was partially true. They had shaped me. Their silence, their judgment, their absence. It carved something into me, a sharpness I didn't know I had, a resolve, a spine. But that didn't mean they earned the reward. That didn't mean they got to step in now, after the fight was over, and claim a trophy they never helped me win. I talked to Ms. Chow again. Ms. Chow said, "You don't owe anyone anything, legally or morally." I asked, "Even if they're family?" Ms. Chow said, "Especially if they're family only when it's convenient." So I started making decisions, private ones, quiet ones, the kind of decisions you only make when you finally see clearly who's with you and who's just near you for the light. And just like that, everything changed. Not because of the money, but because I finally knew who I was in their eyes and who I never wanted to be again. The invitations were simple. No embossed foil, no gold lettering. Just plain white cards slipped discreetly into envelopes and mailed one by one. The message was short. "Dinner, my treat. Saturday at 7 p.m., venue address enclosed. Dress however you feel comfortable. May." No hashtags, no RSVP platform, no mention of birthdays or jackpots or anything to stir gossip. Just dinner. And this time, they all said yes. Funny how fast people rearrange their calendars when money's involved. I chose the venue carefully. Not a hotel ballroom or some flashy five-star spot downtown. This place was quieter. An old brick library that had been converted into a private dining hall with warm lighting, vaulted ceilings, and ivy-covered windows. I'd purchased the building quietly through my LLC 3 months ago. I never put my name on it, not publicly. The floors were polished wood, the tables handmade oak. At the head of the room sat a long banquet table set for 15. Candles flickered down the center. The scent of rosemary and fresh bread filled the air. But there were no waiters in tuxedos, no cameras flashing. I wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no designer heels, just me. Leo stood beside me, adjusting the collar of his blazer. Leo said, "You look terrifying." I raised an eyebrow. I said, "That bad?" Leo grinned. Leo said, "No. I mean it in a good way. Like quiet, powerful. Like you're about to walk into a courtroom and destroy someone." I laughed. I said, "I'm not here to destroy anyone." He tilted his head. Leo said, "Sure you're not." Mrs. Edna arrived next, wearing a navy blue shawl over her shoulders and carrying a small tin of mints she refused to leave home without. Mrs. Edna said, "You didn't tell me this place was so fancy." I replied, "It's just a building." She gave me a knowing look. Mrs. Edna said, "You say that like you didn't buy it." I smiled and offered her my arm as we walked inside. We took our seats at the center of the main table. I sat between Leo and Mrs. Edna, my chosen family. At 6:58 p.m., the first wave arrived. My brother Darren walked in with his wife, both dressed sharply like they were expecting a gala. He gave me an awkward side hug. Darren said, "Wow, May. This place is something else." His wife chimed in quickly. She said, "We thought it was going to be more casual." I said, "You can leave if you're uncomfortable." They both laughed, though I wasn't joking. My parents followed soon after. My mother looked around with a polished smile, the kind she used at church fundraisers. My mother said, "This is beautiful. I didn't know you had a connection here." I said, "I don't." She tilted her head. My father gave me a stiff nod and said, "Glad we could finally get together." I nodded back. I said, "Yes." Finally. My sister and cousins arrived last, whispering among themselves as they took their seats, all eyes darting around like they were waiting for a photographer to jump out from behind a curtain. But there were no photographers, no announcements, just salad, bread, and an uneasy silence. The room buzzed with polite small talk as dishes were passed around. No one asked about the building. No one asked what I'd been up to. But I saw it in their eyes, the curiosity, the calculation, the nervous wondering. They thought I was about to announce something. And they were right. Halfway through the second course, rosemary chicken with lemon potatoes, I stood. I didn't tap a glass. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood. And the room went quiet. I said, "6 months ago, I invited you all to my 30th birthday dinner." I looked around. No one met my eyes. I continued, "I made lasagna. I set the table for 8. I waited." My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced this in my head 100 times. I said, "You chose a beach over me. You toasted someone else's birthday while ignoring mine. And you didn't even bother to lie about it." Still, no one spoke. I took a breath. I said, "That night, I scratched a lottery ticket I'd bought earlier that week, and I won." Forks froze mid-air. Glasses paused mid-sip. I let it hang there for a moment. Then I said, $172 million. Someone exhaled sharply. I think it was Becca. I looked at Leo, who gave me a tiny nod. Then I turned to Mrs. Edna and reached for her hand. I said, "Tonight wasn't about flaunting anything. It wasn't to rub it in. It was to say thank you." Everyone stared, confused. I said, "Thank you to the people who showed up when no one else did." Leo, Mrs. Edna. Leo looked down. Mrs. Edna blinked rapidly. I said, "That night I didn't celebrate with you. I healed with you. You didn't bring gifts or take selfies or make it about you. You simply sat with me, and I'll never forget that." My mother finally spoke, her voice brittle. My mother said, "May, we didn't know. We never meant—" I held up a hand. I said, "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for truth." I looked at each of them, one by one. I said, "You remembered me when the money made headlines. You didn't remember me when I was cooking lasagna, hoping someone would call." My father cleared his throat. He said, "This seems a bit theatrical." I turned to him. I said, "You want a show? Go back to Cabo." Silence. Then I smiled softly. I said, "Tonight's dinner is paid for by a trust I created called the Edna Foundation. It supports elder housing and art scholarships for underfunded students." My mother blinked. My mother said, "What does that mean?" I replied, "It means this building belongs to me, and the rent it generates supports people like Mrs. Edna, people who show up." There was a beat of stunned silence. I continued. "I gave Leo the money to start his dream studio. I helped Mrs. Edna renovate her home and pay off her medical debt. They didn't ask. They never would." I offered. My sister muttered, "You could have helped all of us." I said, "I could have, but you weren't there." Darren said, "You're punishing us for missing one dinner?" I replied, "No. I'm rewarding the people who've never missed me. There's a difference." Nobody touched their plates after that. I sat back down, folded my napkin, and took a slow sip of water. Leo leaned in and whispered, "That was terrifying." I whispered back, "Quiet, powerful?" He grinned. Mrs. Edna patted my hand beneath the table. Mrs. Edna said, "Proud of you, baby." I whispered, "Thank you." The rest of the dinner dragged. Conversation stalled. Some people left before dessert. Others picked at their plates with forced smiles and lowered eyes. But I stayed. I stayed for the ones who stayed for me. The dinner plates had been cleared, but no one reached for dessert. The tension at the table was thick, unspoken, sharp, but too fragile to name. Most of them were still trying to process what I had said. The number, the trust, the very idea that the weird kid they barely tolerated had become the one holding the power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply stood again, calm, deliberate, and spoke. I said, "You know, for most of my life, I thought something was wrong with me." They all looked up, even the ones pretending not to. I continued. I was the quiet one, the emotional one, the one who didn't go into law or finance. I was always too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I looked at my mother. I said, "Do you remember what you used to say whenever I cried as a kid?" My mother shifted uncomfortably and replied, "May, this isn't—" I cut her off gently. I said, "You said, 'Stop being so dramatic. No one wants to deal with a mess.'" No one else moved. I let the silence hold for a breath. I said, "And I believed it. I believed for a long time that my feelings were the problem. That if I just got quieter, smaller, more agreeable, maybe you'd take me seriously. Maybe I'd finally matter." I turned to my sister. I said, "At every family holiday, I was the one washing dishes while you took selfies. I made desserts from scratch while you rolled your eyes and whispered that I had nothing better to do." She looked away. I said, "You didn't forget me. You excluded me. On purpose." My father raised his hand slightly, like he was motioning for a pause. My father said, "That's not fair. We didn't think you'd care that much." I looked him dead in the eyes. I said, "That's the problem. You never thought I mattered." A long breath passed through the room. I continued, "You didn't bully me outright. You didn't scream. You didn't hit. You just ignored. You joked. You minimized. And that kind of pain, it doesn't show up in bruises. It shows up in silence, in shame, in the way I stopped sharing parts of myself because I already knew they'd be dismissed." No one argued. No one defended themselves. I turned to Mrs. Edna and took her hand. I said, "You always brought me soup when I was sick. Even when I didn't ask. You always knocked before walking in. You made me feel like I wasn't a burden." Mrs. Edna smiled through wet eyes and said softly, "Because you never were, sweetheart." Then I looked at Leo, sitting across from me, chin resting on his fist. I said, "And you? You never treated me like a failure, even when I felt like one. When I got that rejection from the art grant and I cried on your couch, you didn't tell me to toughen up. You said, 'Let's print another application.' You believed in me when I couldn't even look at myself." Leo didn't speak at first, just blinked, visibly moved. Then he nodded. Leo said, "You never needed fixing. You just needed space to grow." I turned back to the table. I said, "That's what you never gave me. Space, belief, respect." My mother folded her napkin into tiny creases. My sister picked at her fingernails. Darren was the first to finally speak. Darren said, "Okay, you made your point. But isn't it time to move forward?" I nodded slowly. I said, "It is. And that's why I want to be clear. So there's no confusion." I placed my hands on the back of my chair. I said I gave Mrs. Edna $5 million and a new home with a garden close to her daughter with no stairs and heated floors. Mrs. Edna's hand flew to her mouth. She looked at me, stunned. Mrs. Edna said, "May, I can't accept." I cut her off gently. I said, "You already have. The papers are signed. It's done." She burst into tears, and I bent down to hug her as she sobbed against my shoulder. I turned next to Leo. I said, "And I gave Leo $5 million as well, and full funding for his studio, the one he used to sketch on napkins and dream about in traffic." Leo swallowed hard. Leo said, "Are you serious?" I nodded. I said, "It's already transferred. You start signing leases next week." Leo looked like he was holding back every emotion all at once. He said, "May, you didn't have to." I said, "I know. That's the difference." Then I looked back to the rest of the room. I said, "You'll receive nothing, not because I hate you, but because I love myself enough to stop begging to be seen." My mother said, "May, don't do this. We're still your family." I shook my head. I said, "No, you're my relatives. Family shows up. Family sees you. Family doesn't disappear until money's involved." My father stood, suddenly irritated. My father said, "So that's it? After everything we've done, this is your thanks?" I said, "You didn't do those things for me. You did them because it made you feel good. When I needed support, you offered silence. When I asked for love, you offered conditions." Becca mumbled under her breath, "This is unbelievable." I heard it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I said, "I've spent my life shrinking myself to fit the family mold. But now I realize your mold was too small, not me." I walked to the front of the room and placed a folded letter on the table. I said, "That's a list of local resources and grants you're welcome to apply for, but you'll need to earn what you get from now on." I looked around one last time. I said, "Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And now that it's out, I'm done holding it in." I returned to my seat between Leo and Mrs. Edna. Neither of them said anything. They just reached for my hands, and that was all I needed. It started slowly. The stunned silence stretched too long. Someone coughed. A fork clinked against a plate. I could feel the shift in the room like the air had changed pressure. Then my sister stood up, arms crossed tightly over her chest. My sister said, "You think this makes you better than us?" I stayed seated, calm. I said, "No. But it sure made me free." She scoffed and turned to my mother. My sister said, "Unbelievable. She's lost her mind." My mother stayed seated, but her eyes were glossy. My mother said, "May, after all we've done for you." I tilted my head, still holding Mrs. Edna's hand. I said, "You didn't do things for me. You did them so you could control me. So you could tell people, 'Look how generous we are to poor May.' It was never about helping me. It was about looking good." My father stood abruptly, his voice louder than it needed to be. My father said, "This is a disgrace. You bring us here, pretend to be grateful, and then spit in our faces?" I looked him straight in the eyes. I said, "I didn't pretend anything. I said this dinner was my treat, and it was. I treated you to honesty, for once." Darren slammed his cloth napkin down on the table. Darren said, "I can't believe you're throwing everything back at us just because of a few missed birthdays." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I said, "It wasn't just birthdays. It was years. Years of being talked down to, ignored, excluded. Years of being the butt of the joke. You all just didn't notice because you didn't care." He took a step toward me, face flushed. Darren said, "If you think you're going to humiliate us in public and not face consequences, you're wrong." I leaned back in my chair. I said, "What are you going to do, Darren? Sue me for not giving you money you never earned?" He opened his mouth, but his wife tugged his sleeve. She whispered something, and they both stormed out, muttering under their breath. My cousin Becca stood next, grabbing her purse in a huff. Becca said, "Money changes people, huh?" I said, "Sometimes. But more often it reveals who they've been all along." She posted about me before the night even ended. I saw it later. Wild how fast some people forget where they came from. Won the lottery, lost the plot. She didn't tag me, but we had enough mutuals. People knew. And yet, that post was drowned out by hundreds of others. People I didn't even know. Strangers. Quiet voices from corners of the internet I'd never touched before. They sent messages like, "Thank you for saying what I've never had the courage to." This made me cry. I've been the forgotten daughter too. You didn't lose your family. You chose yourself. That's powerful. And they were right. Back in the dining hall, the exits were starting to fill. One uncle shook his head at me and said nothing as he walked out. Another cousin muttered that I'd changed before following. My mother finally stood. She looked at me with this expression, half grief, half disbelief. My mother said, "You've changed, May." I said, "No. You just never knew me to begin with." She blinked, caught off guard by the softness in my voice. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't angry. I was just done. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She left without another word. Soon, only 4 of us were left at the long banquet table. Me, Leo, Mrs. Edna, and one quiet cousin who'd barely spoken all night. I turned to Leo. I said, "Was that too much?" Leo smiled and said, "That was exactly enough." Mrs. Edna nodded and patted my hand. Mrs. Edna said, "You didn't raise your voice once. That's strength, May." I stayed behind after everyone left, standing in the quiet glow of the chandeliers, letting it all settle. No screaming, no scene, just truth. Later that night, I returned to my apartment. Still the same modest space, though it felt different now, cleaner somehow, lighter. I closed the door behind me, dropped my keys in the bowl, and kicked off my shoes. I stood there in the dark for a moment, listening to the silence. Then I walked to the window, cracked it open, and let the cool air in. I checked my phone. The notifications were out of control again, but this time I didn't feel panic. I scrolled through the messages, the ones that mattered. One said, "Your story made me stop crying for the first time in a week." Another, "I hope one day I can be that brave." I set the phone down and looked around at the space I'd made my own. No applause, no cheers, just peace. And for the first time in my life, it was enough. The first apology came 2 weeks after the dinner. It was a letter folded neatly into an envelope, slid under my apartment door. No stamp, no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakable. My father. The note was short, stiff. "May, I didn't raise you to turn your back on your family. But I see now that maybe we turned our backs first. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you're well." I read it once. Then I folded it back and placed it in a drawer with old photos and scraps of paper from a version of me that no longer needed their permission to exist. Over the next few weeks, others trickled in. Texts from cousins, DMs from my sister, even a voicemail from my mother. In her message, my mother said, "May, I've been thinking a lot. Maybe we didn't do everything right. Maybe we didn't know how." I listened, but I didn't reply. Not out of bitterness. I just didn't have anything left to say. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was done. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's just walking past the door they used to slam shut and choosing not to knock again. I bought a new house a month later. It was nothing outrageous, just a charming place on the edge of town with big windows, a wraparound porch, and a kitchen full of natural light. I'd always dreamed of painting beside sunlight and morning coffee. But I kept the apartment, not because I needed it, but because it held pieces of me. Quiet battles, lonely birthdays, the night I scratched the winning ticket while holding back tears. Some memories don't need to be erased, just acknowledged. The day I gave Mrs. Edna the keys to her new home, she cried so hard she had to sit down on the porch swing. Mrs. Edna said, "Is this really mine?" I said, "All yours. Every brick. And the garden, too. We already planted tulips." She touched the railing with trembling fingers. Mrs. Edna said, "No one's ever done anything like this for me." I said, "You did it first. You just called it soup." She smiled through tears and said, "You'll always be my girl." Leo's gift was quieter. A clean space on the corner of Maple and Fifth. White walls, tall ceilings, lots of room for light and sound and dreams. The first time he walked in, he just stood there, stunned. Leo said, "This is real? This is my studio?" I nodded and said, "You earned it." Leo whispered, "I don't even know what to say." I said, "Then say thank you and build something beautiful." He quit his job the next day. By the end of the month, the windows were filled with his sketches. The sign out front read, "Leo Ross Creative." And for the first time since we were kids, he looked entirely himself. We didn't throw parties. We didn't go viral. We just lived. On my 31st birthday, I didn't invite anyone but them.
No family group chat, no awkward RSVPs, just me, Leo, and Mrs. Edna on my apartment balcony with a view of the streetlights and stars. I ordered takeout, Thai food. We lit candles, played old music. Leo gave me a hand-bound notebook. Edna brought lemon cookies, and I bought myself a cake, chocolate with raspberry filling. No candles, no writing, just smooth icing and thick layers. Leo handed me a fork. Leo said, "Make a wish?" I shook my head and said, "No need. It already came true." We laughed, ate too much, talked late into the night, and I didn't cry while eating it. That was the difference. Last year, I sat alone and held back tears between bites of grocery store frosting. This year, I was full. Not just of cake, of peace. Mrs. Edna leaned back in her chair and looked up at the sky. Mrs. Edna said, "I hope your mother sees you now. The real you." I said, "I hope she sees herself too." Leo asked, "Do you miss them?" I thought about it.
The absence, the noise, the hunger for approval I used to chase like oxygen. And then I said, "No, not anymore." He nodded. Leo said, "That's the real win." Later that night, after they left, I sat alone on the balcony for a while. The cake was half eaten. The wine was down to one last glass. The night air was cool on my shoulders. I picked up my notebook and wrote. They taught me I didn't belong, but the universe reminded me I didn't need to. And then I went inside, closed the door, and smiled.